Now that we've multiprocessed the one file, let's take a look at the additional benefit we could get if we blend from multiple different files. So jumping to Lightroom, we have here image 6502 processed for the sky, the same image processed for the foreground with the 40 points of noise reduction, and then we have the new exposure, the -2 exposure we have not yet used for the sky, and the +2 exposure we've not yet used for the foreground detail. So let's go grab our sky exposure, hitting Command C to copy all the details, and then clicking over to our sky exposure, hitting Command V to paste in those settings. Of course, these two images were shot 2 stops apart, so we need to adjust by taking the exposure up to 3 stops. So that was 1 plus the 2, and now these 2 exposures are essentially the same. Obviously, this alternative exposure, image 6504, has a little bit more sky detail in it. You can see that showing through in the better detail on the horizon here. Let's now go to this other exposure for the foreground, hit Command C to copy its settings, switching over to our other +2 exposure, hitting Command V to paste them in, and then we need to adjust this. This needs to come down by 2 stops, so 1.55 minus 2 is -0.45, and so now these two are balanced. With one additional adjustment, we added a lot of noise reduction in the first version. I don't think we need it here. Let's zoom in and take a look. If we take the noise reduction off, there just isn't that much noise. We can add a little bit, maybe put it around 8 points of noise reduction to clean things up a little bit. But let's use that version as our comparison because we wouldn't add so much noise reduction to this version of the image. Now we can take these 2 new versions and send them over to Photoshop by right-clicking, choose Edit In, and just simply edit in Adobe Photoshop like you would a normal document. Now that we have our 2 new exposures open, we need to copy them over to our layered document. One way you can do that is to right-click on the layer and just simply choose to duplicate it and then designate image 6502, the original source, as the destination. Alternatively, from one of these source documents, just click Pre-Blend in Lumenzia, and then you can tell it you want to go to image 6502 as the output. It'll send everything over. We don't want black masks because we're just simply going to arrange them in order. We can close the sources, and now we have the 2 new images stacked on top. Let's sort them in the proper order and rename them. So on top here, this is our +2 exposure, and let's just mark that. This is going to give us better noise. Let's drag it down above the original base exposure. At this point, it's essentially blocking these lower layers. It's a little bit superior in terms of noise in the image, but it's probably going to have some problems around these needles on the tree. On top is our new sky version, which was created from the -2 exposure. So let's mark that. And for now, let's just hide it. We don't need to look at that. Turning this on and off below, there's not a lot of obvious changes at a high level, but we can see there's some funny stuff happening with the needles here, and there's a minor bit of color shift. Zooming in though to really see the details, now take a look at the original version that we had. This was the original blend we had with noise reduction on image 6502, including the 40 points of noise reduction across this area. You can see that is playing into the sky here, versus the brighter exposure just generally does a better job. There's more detail in it. You see a lot more of what's going on. Look, for example, at the detail in the brick and the sign here in the multi-process version versus blending in the brighter exposure. So it's not necessarily a dramatic difference if you're not going to enlarge the image, but if you're going to print, it certainly makes a difference. Now let's take a look at those tree edges, and looking from before and after, certainly it's problematic. You see, for example, these white spots in the needles there, some really bad blend edges here, and that's where the blend is just kind of a mess. And so obviously we don't want to be blending that in up above. Let's take a look at what's going on in the tree in the middle though, from before and after. And it's adding some detail, but mostly just a little bit of color, and it's just slightly different. So I don't think there's anything critical there. What I want to do is let's zoom back and let's add a black mask to this layer. So we'll alt click on mask, and now we can just grab a white brush hitting B, enlarge that brush, and paint over these areas down below. All we need to do is stay away from those needles on the tree. Those tree edges are obviously not going to blend well, and then we'll zoom in and make sure that the color transition is smooth. Going up in the sky here, it's not going to matter too much because the sky blend from above is going to knock things out. Let's alt click on our mask, just make sure we've got the corners pretty good. And now let's zoom in on the tree and just see from before to after. It's not really showing up at this level. So any discoloration here is very minor, but I might still just kind of go right up the middle of the tree a little bit just to kind of finish that out and make sure it's got max detail. But I think that's going to be good. So at this point, blending in another exposure on top here has given us better detail in the image, clean things up, but it's pretty subtle. And I would say in general, you really don't need to venture away from that original raw file unless you want that tiny little extra bit of detail. And for some people, that's a huge difference. It depends how big you're going to enlarge the image. Now let's take a look at the sky, and where it's going to make a difference is right here in the middle. Now if we make this layer visible, it's of course going to change everything in the image, and we don't want that. We only want this to appear where we've already masked in this underlying layer. An easy way to do that is to create a clipping mask, which you can do by right-clicking on the layer and choose Create Clipping Mask, or just hold Alt and hover between the layers, then you can click to add or remove a clipping mask. But with a clipping mask, now it's simply showing through on top of that underlying layer in just the same areas. And what we can do is take this area where we want the better sky and blend it in. So hold Alt Mask to add a black mask, hitting B for our brush once again, and now just brush over that area of sky to blend in the sky there. And now look from before to after, and you can see how we've added just a little more realism to that sky. And honestly, I don't know if I consider that much of a benefit, but it does enhance the sky a little bit there in terms of making it more technically correct. So in general, we were able to get most of the benefit here by using a single raw, which was processed across these three layers. This was the single raw file, and then we've got our +2 exposure here, which is a little bit brighter, and we had our -2 exposure here, which was a little bit darker. So across these, I would say in general, I would just stick with the green layers and multi-process a single raw. If you want to add anything, I'd say the shadow detail is most important, and an easy way to do it is going to be blend it below areas of moving detail like these tree leaves. So if you just simply add it down below with a paintbrush or a gradient, and then you can use the multi-process from the other version. If you wanted to extract maximum detail from this image, what you would need would be the base exposure with noise reduction, which is going to help you transition in the areas around the tree and sky. We wouldn't need this detail layer, so you can ignore that. We would need our +2 exposure for basically below the horizon to add more detail down below in the shadow areas and possibly up into the tree trunk here, depending on how much time you want to spend painting those areas. For the sky, we'd need our same base exposure 6502 because it needs to exactly match the areas around the tree which are moving. And then we'd have image 6504, which you could blend in any other parts of the sky, but the place where you really need it is that small little sliver that we painted in here.